Alright, what we're going to do in this vodcast is talk about the scientific method. And this is going to be the first lesson of 7 in Unit 1. So we'll talk about what the scientific method is and some different aspects of the scientific method. First of all, before we get to that, we need to define a few things. And since this is Unit 1, Lesson 1, let's start off by defining chemistry. So, if we're going to define chemistry, let me get myself a pen. We're going to say that the definition of chemistry is the study of matter, but then we're also going to say it's in the changes that matter undergoes. So that's a pretty important part of this definition. It's the study of matter, but then the changes that matter undergoes. Basically, throughout the year, we're going to talk about two concepts, matter and energy. We'll talk about how atoms rearrange and form new products, but then we'll also talk about how much energy is released and absorbed when that process happens. Since this is chemistry, we're going to be talking about chemical reactions. Chemical reactions all take place with matter, and all of them either release energy or absorb energy. So those two concepts are going to be very important as we move through the year. The other thing that we're going to be talking about a lot with chemistry in terms of matter is mass and volume. So we just want to define those two terms first. First of all, mass is anything that contains matter, and anything that contains matter contains atoms. So as we're talking about atoms from the periodic table, we're talking about mass. Volume, then, is anything that takes up space and has or contains matter and takes up space. So as we're talking about mass, we will be talking about a few things. Number one, what its actual mass is, but then also how much volume it takes up. Basically, what it comes down to is matter is anything that you can see or describe in nature, and then energy is, well, we'll talk about the definition of what energy is later, but basically it's a transfer of heat from one system to another. Everything else would fall into a different category, such as magic or stuff like that. We're talking in this class about things that are made up of atoms and how much energy they release or absorb. Okay, so let's go through the steps of the scientific method. First of all, many of you have had science courses up to this point, and all of them you have talked about the scientific method, and you've probably heard everywhere from 3 to 7 steps. Well, we're going to summarize the scientific method in 4 steps. First of all, the first step in the scientific method is you have to have some sort of phenomenon that you're observing. Some people say this is developing a problem or noticing a problem. For example, in nature, you might notice that things always fall towards the earth when you let go of them. So that's your observation. The next step in the scientific method is what we call the hypothesis. Now, you've probably heard that hypothesis means an educated guess. Well, we're going to say it's a little bit more than a guess. It's an explanation of the observation that you made. So in other words, you see that things, when you let go of them, fall towards the earth. When you hold a brick, it falls towards the earth. When you hold a penny, it falls towards the earth. So you come up with some sort of explanation for this. And a pretty smart guy way back when said, all things that contain matter will fall at the same rate towards the earth, and that rate is, or I should say that acceleration is 9.8 meters per second squared. So anyway, the next step in this process is testing your hypothesis. What that means is you're going to develop experiments to see if your explanation of what you think is going on actually holds true. So this person may have taken something that weighs 5 grams, something that weighs 20 grams, and something that weighs 500 grams, taken them to different heights, and dropped them towards the earth, and then measured how much time it takes for those pieces of matter to hit the earth. If your explanation holds true and your hypothesis turns out to be correct, the next step would be to develop some sort of theory or law based on your experiments. So for example, these sets of experiments would lead to a scientific law. In other words, anything that contains matter will fall at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. Now we'll talk about the difference between a theory and a law a little bit later, but basically what we're going to say is that a scientific law states what happens and a scientific theory explains what happens. And again, we'll get into a little bit more detail with that concept a little bit later. Okay, so for example, we just talked about Newton's law of gravity. His observation was that things fall towards the earth. His hypothesis was that anything that contains matter is going to fall towards the earth at 9.8 meters per second squared. His experiments were, actually I think it was Galileo that did this, wasn't it? His experiments were dropping things of different masses, different heights, timing to see how long it takes them to fall to the earth, and he found that all of them fell at 9.8 meters per second squared. And the universal gravitation law, or universal law of gravitation, was the end result. Okay, let's talk about these two terms. As we're doing experiments, we want to talk about observations. And our observations are either going to be quantitative or qualitative. Pretty simple terms. Quantity means what? It means you contain numbers. So any measurement that is going to involve a number is going to be a quantitative measurement. For example, you could say that I am 72 inches tall. A qualitative observation, or a qualitative measurement for that matter, could be I am tall. So no numbers, no units, numbers, and units. And we'll talk about our units a little bit later. Okay, so for example, let's get ourselves a pen. So for example, a book is heavy. Qualitative or quantitative? Qualitative. In other words, it might be heavy to one person, not so heavy to another person. So what that means is that qualitative observations can be what we call subjective. In other words, it depends on the person making the observation. However, if we say a book has a mass of 900 grams, that is objective. In other words, it's a measurement with a unit. There's no debating whether or not the mass is 900 grams or not. So quantitative, number and a unit. Qualitative, more of a description. The tub is as large as a gas can. Qualitative, the tub has a volume of 35 liters. Quantitative. Okay, that's going to do it for this first lesson. So just to go back and review, we defined what chemistry was, what matter was, what volume was, and energy. And then we talked about the scientific method and the 4 basic steps. In the scientific method, we make observations, and then we talked about the difference between qualitative and quantitative. We will see you for lesson 2 on our next podcast.